Through my experience as a therapist and honestly just from being a human being, I've realized this truth that we drift. Like, we naturally drift away from things that are typically good and wholesome. Have you ever noticed that? We rarely drift towards things that are good, right? When we're not really trying, when we're just kind of like coasting in life, we rarely drift in a good direction regarding our health and our exercise and diet and our budget and into healthy relationships. I can't tell you how many times I have naturally drifted towards Chick-fil-A. Like, I will be driving along and all of a sudden I'm in Chick-fil-A's brilliant 2-line ordering system, getting myself excited about a number 1 with waffle fries and like 4 Chick-fil-A sauces. Like, it just happens. The problem is I don't drift into the gym. Like, I have to make a very conscious effort to get to the gym. I don't find myself kind of on a run the same way I find myself at Chick-fil-A. Like, I have to work, I have to make a conscious choice to start to run. We don't drift into healthy relationships. We have to be intentional. I think most of us are working with kind of a default setting that is flawed or broken because most of us were also raised in a flawed or broken family system. Even if we were raised in this wonderful, perfect family, we still live in a broken world where we develop unhealthy patterns of behavior and relating to others. And so when we drift relationally, we tend to drift in a negative direction. This also relates to our relationship with God, right? It takes intentionality and time and discipline and effort. The gravitational pull of life typically will take us in the wrong direction. So in every area of life that is important, we tend to be swimming upstream. And let me tell you guys, culture, they're not going to facilitate our relationship with God. It's not going to facilitate a healthy relationship with ourselves and with others. And it also really doesn't facilitate a healthy relationship in our own mental health. I don't think we're really taught how to be emotionally healthy. We tend to just learn and pick up from things around us and the people around us. And how many of you guys would say that your parents are completely emotionally healthy individuals? How many of you say your parents handle conflict really well? They know how to be in relationship well. They know how to cope with their feelings well. How many of you would say your parents struggle with anger and sadness and even gossip? How many would you say are passive aggressive with you or just straight aggressive with you? What about your friends? Right? I mean, I think we got to face it. In most areas of our lives, we are surrounded by people who are also kind of drifting towards some unhealthy ways of coping. And here's why I ask those questions. I think as a culture, we tend to value our bodies more than our minds, right? When you see a physical symptom, do you value that more than a symptom that you may see emotionally? Right? There's no doubt, if you break your leg, you're going to find yourself at the hospital. You're going to know what to do, and you're going to take that really seriously. But do you know what to do when you're depressed? Do you know where to go? Do you know what you actually, like that next step that you would need to take? You may know how to maintain your physical health, but do you know how to maintain your mental and emotional health? I want to look at some stats here just from Boulder County teenagers. It's about 28%, so more than 1 in 4, reported that they felt so sad or hopeless almost every day for at least a 2-week period that they kind of just stopped doing some of their normal daily activities. That's what we'd call just depression. 15%, about 1 in 6, said that they purposely self-harmed, whether that was through cutting or burning in the past year. 14%, so like 1 in 7 students, reported that they seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. 12% said that they have made a plan on how they would kill themselves. And 6%, so just over 1 in 20, reported they attempted suicide in the past year. If you think about your typical math class, if it has 20 or 30 kids in it, it means statistically, 1 or 2 kids in that class would have attempted suicide, and that a handful of them would be even thinking about it over the course of a year. And here's the deal with depression. It's kind of the silent killer. It's one of the reasons why it goes so unnoticed by other people around us. You wake up in the morning and you can't get away from it. You're at lunch and you're with your friends and it's just constantly nagging at you in the gut. Or you're at a soccer game and you just have this constant feeling of despair. And what we so often do is we try to hide it, right? We walk through our relationships in places where we're supposed to be safe to talk about what's going on in our life, but we don't really tell people what's going on with us. And so if you show up to school and you feel like you're faking it, you don't really want them to know what's going on with you, what's at the core of what's happening. And you realize, or don't even realize, that they're probably struggling with the same thing. Or you show up to church week after week after week, but you don't really want to show it there either. And the more you try to hide it, the deeper and deeper it gets. And then life gets busy and life gets loud and people are kind of moving on and you don't really know what you need to do. And you have these dreams of this person you want to be and places you want to go, and you just kind of hit this wall. And the depression hits and you feel like you can't move past it. And this happens to you day after day, week after week, month after month, and you want to be free, but it feels like it's holding you back. The thing too is, I don't think that we really all understand depression. I think part of that is because it does tend to look so different for different people. There's such a wide spectrum of how this actually shows itself. To give you guys some examples, a young man I was working with, and he was on the honor roll. He had a really close girlfriend. He was a varsity athlete. He was actually looking at playing varsity or college sports on a scholarship. He had an intact and close family, but he just kind of felt numb. He felt very, very little variety in his day-to-day life. He also struggled to feel any positive feelings about himself. Even though he was a successful young man, he just kind of felt like blah, like he just felt whatever. He said once he felt like he just has forgotten what joy feels like. Another young man in a different kind of capacity, he really struggled with his grades. He wasn't very involved with school. He struggled in his friendships. He also wasn't very close with his parents. And frankly, they really struggled to be good parents to him. He believed in God, but he wasn't real, involved in his faith either. And I was like, he could not think of a single nice thing to say about himself. But I think he would say that he hated himself, and that depression just continued to get worse and worse and worse for him. He oftentimes even ended up using chemicals to just make himself feel better, to try to numb the pain. Another student that I've worked with before, who was once again honor roll varsity athlete, he was a really super social and outgoing young man. He was heading off to a prestigious college. He just came across as this super happy guy. He had close family and friends. He knew Jesus. But he was going through a really tough season in his life, where he had broken up with his girlfriend. He had a pretty major athletic injury, and he just struggled with direction in his life. He was hurting and in pain, but he didn't know how to feel it. He didn't know how to express it. I guess depression, it just looks so differently for so many different people. We know that depression and cutting and suicidal ideation, it affects your generation as much as any other problem does. Suicide just recently passed homicide as the second leading cause of death among 15 to 24-year-olds. Second only to accidental deaths, such as car accidents. Or we know that 1 in 4 teens have a depressive episode, but the saddest part is that only 30% of those kids actually get help. You guys may be thinking, like, this talk is really depressing, but there is good news. Depression is incredibly treatable. 80% of individuals treated for depression see marked improvement, oftentimes leading to very few depressive symptoms at all. And so while we are confronted with a serious and deadly issue, you guys, there is so much hope for healing for us. So what I want to do is I want to dive into a well-known story. I want to give you guys some symptoms and common symptoms of depression. I also want to differentiate between normal sadness that we all feel as well as actual depressive symptoms. And also just set a biblical precedent for depression. If you have attended church for any length of time, you have probably heard of David. David is one of the most famous men from the Bible. He also was one of the most successful. And David was your honor roll varsity athlete who was good looking. He had money. He was the most confident, popular guy you can think of. I mean, he is the David of David and Goliath, who just as a young kid defeated a giant who everyone else was afraid of. This kid literally started his career as like the champion of UFC. I mean, he was the mightiest warrior the world had ever seen. And he also was the king of Israel, God's chosen people. He led them into victory after victory. He led them into prosperity. He also married the most beautiful women in the land. I mean, he was, by all accounts, like this perfect guy. But then something changed for him. We actually read in the Psalms, verse 6 of chapter 6, "I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. David said that. And what's interesting is that this aligns with one of the first depressive symptoms I would be looking for as a counselor. A depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, that feeling of just sadness. Now, sadness is a normal part of the human emotion. It's important that we feel sad. But typical sadness typically doesn't feel like this life sentence on a normal scale. And for those of you who have lost a loved one or you've experienced something traumatic, that sadness may feel like it's never going away, and there's a depth to that grieving process. But on a day-to-day kind of normal ups and downs, day-to-day sadness, there tends to be room for alleviation. You have periods where you don't really feel sad at all, when you're just kind of enjoying life. But depression, it's a different beast entirely. It doesn't really follow any of those normal emotional rules. In moderate depression, low mood is fairly consistent throughout the day. But in severe depression, that depressive episode is just constant and daily, and it feels unrelenting. And that seems to be what David is describing here. Another statement from David is Psalm 13:2. He says, "How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me?" Again, this corresponds with another main symptom of depression, a diminished interest or pleasure in daily activities. See, being sad, once again, it can feel terrible, but even if you're moderately sad, you're still typically able to enjoy things that you used to love before that sadness hit. It may take a little bit of prompting, but typically you start to feel better, you start to have fun again. Whereas with depression, it feels like there is almost no hope. It may be so much work to have fun doing any of the things you used to enjoy doing. Or maybe you just used to enjoy sports or riding or being with your friends, but now you feel like you can't get through the fog of sadness to even feel excited about them. Or maybe they even feel pointless. In that case, you may very well be experiencing depression. We jump back to David, this time in Psalm 22. He says, "My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night I find no rest. I can't sleep." And then in 102, he says, "My heart is blighted and withered like grass. I forget to eat my food. In my distress I groan aloud. I am reduced to skin and bones." Again, what David is describing are symptoms of depression, weight loss or gain, or increased or decreased appetite, insomnia or hypersomnia, where I can't sleep at all or I sleep way too much. Again, with normal sadness, we may struggle with wanting to eat, or we may struggle with eating too much, and so once again, with sleep. But with depression, as you experience that over a long period of time, and as you start to combine that with some of the other symptoms, it's very likely that you're experiencing a depressive episode. Right, there may be times, I think especially as teenagers, where we may feel less energetic, or we may just kind of feel tired because of the schedules that you keep. With depression, these symptoms, once again, in combination with others, can be really serious signs. But our main character, David, he's still not done. In chapter 22 of Psalm, he says, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people." Which leads me to one of the most common symptoms of depression. That's feelings of worthlessness and excessive guilt. Now, in normal life, right, you may feel responsible or even a bit bad about something you've done, but you don't really experience that permanent sense of worthlessness or guilt. Whereas depression, one of the most distinctive features is that your thoughts become incredibly self-punishing. It's difficult to see yourself as anything except for rotten or bad or worthless, or to blame for everything. Kind of like that young man I was talking about earlier. And then David, he ends kind of in his own depressive symptoms with this. In 55, he says, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me." And David also talks about death in a couple other places as well. And I think that points to David having these recurrent thoughts of death, which, like suicidal ideation, is a significant symptom we got to keep our eye out for in depression. See, if I'm talking to David in my office, I'm feeling pretty strongly that he's in the midst of a severe depressive episode. But how did he get here? What led to one of the Bible's mightiest men feeling this way? Well, let's understand his story. Let's dive into 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. It says, in the spring, or the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. See, David became isolated. When all his friends and his men left for war, David stayed home. He was alone. Now, the Bible doesn't really tell us why, but typically he would have gone with them. He was the general. He was the best warrior. Why would he stay home? I think this happens to us too sometimes, right? When we start to feel down or when there is a global pandemic, we can get isolated. And now if that is a struggle that you are dealing with right now, please go back and listen to the talk from last week, because it's able to spend more time, the time that we need as we explore loneliness and relational hurts. But for this talk, the point I will make is this, that while we do need our alone time, we also need to be in community. We are not made to always be alone. And I think that had David gone to war with his men, this entire story may have played out differently. But we continue in verse 2. It says, one evening David got up from his bed and walked around the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And it's in this moment, right, he's alone, he has a temptation, and he has a choice. How does he handle it? Verse 3, it says, David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who was off at war. So then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. My second point from his story, and I think lesson we can take from him, is that he did something that he wouldn't normally do, that wasn't really normally within his character, but he wanted to do it anyway. I see this with young men and women on a pretty regular basis, that when we're feeling down, we're feeling some of those depressive symptoms, we make choices that we wouldn't really typically make if we were feeling better. Or we kind of justify, well, because I feel this way, it makes it more okay to try to cope with this chemical or with this drug or with this person. When we don't feel good, it's easier to justify trying out things that we wouldn't typically do, the things that aren't really within our character. I was working with a young man recently, and he has struggled with depression for years now. And he's tried to stay clean and not fall into doing things he wouldn't typically do, but ultimately he started to justify new actions one by one. He had experimented with weed and alcohol before, but never with regularity. Then all of a sudden he was getting high all the time, surely as an attempt to keep his depressive feelings at bay. But as we all know, once the high starts to wear off, our problems always come back. A chemical can't solve our emotions and hurts in the long term. And so this man started trying other drugs too, anything to take the edge off of his depression. He did LSD a couple of times, justifying it wasn't a big deal, it was just an experience. But after a couple of trips and a few more other chemicals in his system, he started noticing how his brain was processing differently, and his pain just continued to intensify. And ultimately, this young man now is fighting a chemical addiction as well as depression, to the point of being in and out of rehab and a few hospital stays. Now, I don't say this to be dramatic or try to scare you into being sober. That doesn't work. I know that doesn't work. But I do point out that just as David was susceptible to things that he wouldn't typically have done, so are we. And I promise you that whatever the behavior is that you're hoping will make you feel better, the high, the porn, the relationship, it won't truly make you feel better. You may feel better in the moment, but it never lasts and it never solves our problems. Only opening up, getting help, working to be our healthiest selves will be what actually turns things around. Back to our story. It says the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. So David sent this word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And essentially, David brings Bathsheba's husband home so that they can sleep together, and then everyone will think that Bathsheba is pregnant with her husband, not with David. David tries to cover up his wrongdoing. He tries to cover up his life. And that's, I think, another lesson that we can take from David, is that when we're feeling down or depressed or we've done something we feel guilty about, that's oftentimes what we try to do, right? We delete the search history or the conversation or the picture. Or if there isn't really a sin behind our feelings, which I do want to make the point that we can feel desperate even when we haven't done anything wrong, but then we still can oftentimes isolate. I speak with so many high schoolers who feel like they are hiding themselves, always feeling like they have to put on a mask to get through the day. When we hide, we always end up feeling worse. But see, in our story, ultimately, Uriah, he wasn't willing to sleep with his wife when all of his fellow men were still at war. He was too loyal and true to them. So David had to take things even a step further. In verse 14, it says, "In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, 'Put Uriah out in the front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die.'" Essentially, David gives Uriah his death sentence. See, David was now desperate, and he took the ultimate step. He had Uriah killed. This man of God, this great hero in our story, is now essentially a murderer. And what we see is this in this story is a man's life spinning out of control. Now, again, I need to pause here because I want to make a very strong point that some of you guys are listening and you're feeling depressed and you totally understand those symptoms that we've been walking through. I want to make sure that you don't hear me say that you may be depressed because of something you've done wrong. We can feel depressed for many, many reasons, and not because we've sinned. It is not a sin to feel depressed. The point that I'm trying to make is that we can learn from some of David's process, where we can identify the isolation and the loneliness we may feel and seek to be in community, a community of people that we trust who will lift us up. We can be sure to not hide our feelings and our hurts, but rather come into the light so that we can receive help. We don't have to suffer alone. We don't have to be fake. Guys, it's okay to feel depressed, so let's not do this thing alone. And we can also make sure that in our hurting, we move towards health rather than chemicals or decisions that will only lead us down a harder path. I also tell the story of David because ultimately there is redemption. David heals. He gets his life back. He moves back into a relationship with God, and in that place, God redeems his story and his life. David found relief from his suffering in God's unchanging character and infinite faithfulness and unconditional love. David took his pain to God, and there he found a foundation of hope from which he could rebuild, hope that transcends our circumstances, even our depression. And I do hope that you feel that there is hope for us too. Because I have countless examples of teens working in counseling who have started with severe depression. And for some, it was months, others, it was a couple years. But at some point, they no longer had any of those symptoms that we've been talking about. That is the hope in depression, is that it is so incredibly treatable. As long as we get help and don't hide, we can see and feel the change that we so desperately want. So please, take your next step. Open up to someone you trust about your struggles. Replace lies that you believe with truth. Try out counseling. Talk to your leader. Even discuss with your doctor the possibility of trying out a medication just to even help things get stabilized. I believe there is no shame in trying out and taking medication for a season of life. You guys, we know that we tend to drift when we're not working hard at something. So recognize that for yourself. I hope that you think through these symptoms that we've talked about, that you can maybe even identify or place yourself within that. To challenge yourself, to really recognize the difference between what is sadness and really what is depression. And the work to not allow yourself to become isolated, work on how to cope well with our feelings, which we're going to end up talking about in another talk. And ultimately, please reach out to your leader or to Gabe and keep pursuing Jesus, because I so believe that there's infinite healing that can come from a relationship with him.